Hello everyone. Um, I have to admit this is quite unusual. It's not the usual setup that I would have usually given a talk, and I'm pretty sure it's not the usual setup for most of you to be watching talks just online without the real interaction. So excuse me if I sounded in sometimes not so interactive as usual. So before I start, I would like to, of course, wish that every one of you and your families is safe and remind you that with solidarity is the only way that we will be able as humanity to get through these really rough times. Also, I'm used to starting my presentations by telling fancy stories or trying to, I don't know, do some weird attention grabbers or so on. But I just would like to ask you, before watching this talk, to try to keep an open mind, right? None of us, including myself, knows everything in the world. And sometimes there are topics that are uncomfortable. But we still need to discuss these topics because we are adults and because we are mature people, and discussing these topics or having these topics in an open conversation is our only way to get through this. So, I just wanted to start with a note to remind everyone to keep an open mind and try to be open to listening to such topic. So before I start, my name is this super hard name, Amr Abdelwahab. I know it's super hard to pronounce. You probably are not the only one in my life that's not able to pronounce my name properly, but yeah, it is this. I am a tech lead in a company called Tourlane, a company in the travel industry, which I'm sure you all know is kind of struggling at the moment, in Berlin, in Germany. And for those of you, especially in the Lisp community, you probably are not so familiar with me, but I'm a very active member of the Ruby community. So I am one of the organizers of Code Curious, which used to be called Rails Girls Berlin. I am one of the organizers of the Ruby user group in Berlin. I was the chair organizer of European Ruby conference in 2017 in Budapest. And I'm involved in many other initiatives and big topics in the Ruby community. And I give a lot of talks, so this is not my only talk, and most of my talks a lot of my talks have a lot of technical discussions and technical background, but all of them, without any exceptions, always have this one specific slides that I try to remind each one who's watching this talk that communities matter the most. And you need to remind yourself that even the technical excellence is a topic that I really, really care for, and that business is really important and everything. But at the end, we write code, we write technology for people to use, and we write technology with other people, right? This is the most important part. Technology in the core is about people, is not about anything else. I was born and raised in Cairo, in Egypt in North Africa. And in 2013, I moved to Budapest in Hungary. And then again, I moved to Berlin in 2017, and since then I have been living there. So usually my thought process when I start to think of a new talk is asking myself, okay, why do I want to give this talk, and why is it me who would like to who should be giving this talk? Like, why is this, what is in me that makes me eligible, or I don't know, the person who is eligible to give this talk should be me. And I start with one thing. This is not an expert talk, right? So the topic that I'm going to speak about is something that I'm not an expert at. I am actually a software engineer like most of you. I write code or I deal with business problems every morning. So this is not my domain of expertise, but this is rather a talk from the heart. It's something that comes from my feelings. And as much as this topic usually is deemed irrelevant in many technical conferences and many technical gatherings, people are saying, okay, why should I talk about these topics in technical gatherings? And you need to start with one thing, and one very important fact. This topic impacts the daily life of myself and thousands, if not even hundreds of thousands or even millions of fellow developers, people you actually can work or actually working with today. The second reason is the Dunning-Kruger effect, which myself included. For those of you who don't know Dunning-Kruger is a cognitive bias where people assess their cognitive ability as greater than it is. So in a nutshell, people think of themselves to be smarter than they are, and then they start to operate based on this. And especially in these topics that I'm gonna start to touch soon, a lot of people just think of themselves that they are familiar with the whole context, or that they know the whole thing, while it's not true. And that was the second trigger that I felt that, okay, this is very important to make people realize that we are not always as smart as we are. Finally, I myself come from a very privileged background. My parents were middle to high class family. I have to admit this. They provided me with proper education, and I come from a almost like a kind of rich family. And my parents are also Muslims, which in Egypt is a privilege, right? It's not in Europe anymore, but back there, when you are a Muslim, that's something that adds to your privilege score. Also, you probably can't see much from this camera, but my skin is a lighter shade of black, and unfortunately, even in Africa, still the white lighter shades of black are more dominant, are more privileged compared to the black people, right? So that was also one reason that added to my privilege. I am a cisgender straight male. So in a nutshell, I had the whole package of privilege, right? And I personally, in the past, when confronted by anyone from the many underprivileged communities around Egypt, I felt sympathy. So if someone who is Christian in Egypt, or a gay person, a gay friend of mine, or a woman would come and complain about something, I deeply and truly felt sympathy. I was never one of those people who would say, okay, I don't care. No, I felt this sympathy. But deep inside my brain, I always had this question, right? Which is, why is that person so sensitive about it? Why is that person making so much fuss? Why are they making a big deal out of this topic, right? And I honestly also fell for a lot of the common fallacies, common fallacious arguments that people use to argue against these things, which I will also dig deeper later. So I was saying things like, but this is reverse sexism, or all sorts of these things that now I understand are fallacies. They are not really valid arguments, as I will show you in this presentation, hopefully. But I personally fell with these arguments. But then I moved to Europe in 2013, as I previously mentioned, right? And for the first few years, I started to notice this weird change in my life, where on daily basis I am facing with actions of disdain, where people are actually looking down to me without me doing anything, just being myself, right? And I realized that there are situations, in most situations I needed to do 10 times more effort to achieve the same result of a fellow European colleague. In fact, this sentence was told to me explicitly by my German manager at some point. My German manager took me in a one-on-one and said, man, you are brown, you need to do 10 times more effort to achieve the same result of your German colleague, without even hiding it. I was facing what today I will call racist behaviors everywhere all the time. Back then, at the first few years, I didn't. I was not sure that this... I was actually questioning myself, is it me who is becoming oversensitive, like those friends I used to talk about before? Maybe. Am I doing something wrong, that those people are not understanding me or something? Also maybe. And then I started doing more readings and research on the topic, because let's be clear about it. This is not a new topic. This is not something that appeared in 2019 as the right wing tries to always claim. This is a topic that has been there since the last century. For more than 100 years, there are lots of literature, lots of academia work that has been done on this topic. This is not something new that we are starting to talk about today. And after these readings, I realized that my whole life, this whole 20 years, 22, 23, 24 years, first block of my life, I was just missing a lot of context. I just didn't realize what's surrounding those people that I always deemed to be sensitive. So I decided that I will try to target people who are like myself back then, when I didn't understand this context. People who unintentionally do things that damage their peers, who unintentionally, because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, think that they are smarter than others. And I insist here on the word unintentionally, because if you are one of the people who intentionally damage others, I don't think you are welcomed into this talk. So I would just ask you to sign out in this case. And I also decided that I will try to add as much context as I can to the topic within the scope of this next few minutes, right? Maybe it will help someone trigger this conversation and think with themselves with why is these topics that important. So let's start with one thing. The presentation will go through several sections. The first section, it will try to speak about political, ethical description of what does it mean privilege, what are the fallacies surrounding it. The second section is more about how does this impact your product, how does this impact your technical product at the end, right? And finally, I will try to give some, let's say, recommendations on what you can do in order to improve the situation. So about the ethical part, many people start their presentations usually in conferences, especially academic conferences, by fetching some definition from the internet and from some dictionary or Wikipedia or whatever. And I just would like to tell you that especially when you are speaking about social sciences, there is no such thing as a dictionary definition that applies. You cannot just do that. So whatever dictionary definition you have in any dictionary about privilege or racism, just forget it, because that is not how it is. These concepts are way deeper to describe in one sentence like this. So I was thinking, okay, how can I describe it in a simplified, overly simplified example? So I came up with this silly game that I would like to ask each one of you to calculate in your brain now, your privilege score, right? Try to add 1 to yourself, to your privilege score, if, for example, and this is a very simple example, you can go to the social media, to Facebook, to Twitter, to Instagram, to whatever social media platform you use, and just post whatever post you have in mind now, without ending up in jail, murdered, or in exile, right? It sounds like an exaggeration. Here, with me in this picture is Patrick George Zaky. Patrick is one of my closest friends in my life. Patrick, back on the 7th of February in 2020, so less than 2 or 3 months ago, Patrick is an academic researcher in Bologna University in Italy, and by posting few posts on Facebook criticizing the Egyptian government, upon arrival to spend his holiday on the 7th of February, he was arrested, and until now he is in jail. He is in jail for just posting stuff on Facebook. Patrick is not a special case. There are more than 60,000 Egyptian political detainees. I myself was once a political detainee in Egypt, and plenty of our friends. It's a privilege. It's not something that is so natural as you are assuming, that you can just say whatever you want, because in many places around this world, people can just simply say whatever they want. It's not that easy for everyone as you think it is. Add to your score a +1 if you can go to anyone and confess your love. You can go to anyone you love and say, I love you, without getting murdered or prosecuted for it. Because I can add 1 to myself. I am a straight male here, right? But I know for sure that gay people in Eastern Europe, in places in Eastern Europe, in places in Africa, in Egypt, where I was born and raised, if they say that, they can end up being murdered for it, or they can end up being in jail for just the sake of going to a person of the same gender and saying, I love you. That's the extent of it. Also, and this is very important when it comes to technical conferences and gatherings. There is always in technical conferences, I don't know in the Lisp community, but in the Ruby community, there are a lot of remote companies. And whenever I go to a Ruby conference, there is always this one talk that speaks about benefits of remote work and working everywhere. But these kind of talks ignores the fact that if you are not white European or white North American, you don't have this luxury to live wherever you want. It's not that easy for me. In fact, I need a visa almost to go everywhere. Probably I need a visa to go to the bathroom or something. So it's not that easy. You need to be aware of your privilege, that you can travel almost anywhere you want with a very simple visa process, and that's not the same for everyone around the world. Also, add 1 to yourself if you, every time you traveled, I mean, now there are no airports, but when there were airports, every time you are in the airport, you're not selected in the random selection queue. My name has Muhammad as a second name. I look quite Middle Eastern, and I can guarantee for you that almost every time I'm in an airport security queue, I am randomly selected and searched. I can keep going with this list forever, right? But in a nutshell, what I'm trying to say here is that Privilege is something that you can do and others can't do, and your assumption that you can do this thing that everyone can is not true. Privilege is not something also set in stone, as I showed from my example, that I was from a Muslim family in Egypt, and there it was a privilege. Here it's not. It's very coupled to its context, right? And privileges also intersect, and intersectionality is a very interesting concept. Intersectionality comes like this: a white woman is underprivileged compared to a white man, but a white woman is overprivileged compared to a black woman. And every single privilege you miss when intersects with another thing introduces a totally new identity. So every intersection of privileges creates a totally new underprivileged status. And saying this, it's also very important to note that you cannot be one of the people who focuses on one goal. You cannot say, I am only defending gay people, but then you are being racist doing it. You have to understand that all these privileges intersect, and in order to stand by one subsection of people who are underprivileged, you really need to support the others. You cannot do it on the benefit of the others. Very important also, privilege is something that is super hard to realize. I am pretty sure plenty of you here hear these words and feel a bit offended, like I am not privileged, I am good, it's not my... Yeah, it is hard to realize. It's hard for you to understand what others can't do that you can do, because for you it's super easy to do. But the core part of this talk is that privilege is not necessarily evil. When I call you a privileged person, I am not cursing you, I am not saying a bad thing about you, I am just simply stating a fact that you are privileged. And by privileged, that means that you have some extra duties that you need to do in order to help others without this privilege. Okay, the question that always pops up at this moment is, I did nothing wrong, right? I was just born a white male. I did nothing wrong, and I totally understand. So why would I need to do more efforts, right? What makes me need to do these more efforts? The question here can take us back to the coding life, right? Like you as a software engineer. I'm pretty sure everyone watching this talk at the moment have had at some point maintained a legacy code base, right? A technical debt, let's say. And let me try to elaborate in this example. When you inherit a project, for some reason, you know for sure that the previous developers who have worked on this project have done their best, right? They really tried to maintain this project to a high standard in many cases. However, in some situations, they have had to build some incomplete solutions because, I don't know, they were told that we have a deadline in a month from now, you need to finish, so they just hacked the solution without caring so much about maintainability. Or they just didn't know the future, which is natural, right? Sometimes you take uninformed decisions. You make an assumption, you implement something in a wrong way because you are not sure about the future, right? And that's totally natural. This world is uncertain and this can happen. Or honestly, I don't know how often it happens in the Lisp community. People in the Ruby community follow hypes quite often, so they would just go to a conference like this, someone is talking about the newest language, the newest framework, the newest library, and then they come back and they just would like to use this library in their project without even understanding if their project really needs it, and that simply is not nice. And that's what introduces, like these three situations, introduces what we all, everyone who is in this watching this stream now, call a technical debt, right? It's something that you need to pay. And it's important to note that when you deal with technical debt, you cannot simply ignore what happened in the past. So you cannot inherit this project and say, oh yeah, this project is perfect, nothing happened in the past, I will just keep writing and adding features, and I'm not caring about what happened in the past, right? Because you will end up having a project that's really unmaintainable eventually. Also, you cannot rewrite everything from the beginning, because otherwise you will end up spending your life rewriting everything every 2 weeks. The way to deal with technical debt is that you have to keep moving forward. You have to keep shipping new stuff, but you always have to keep being mindful of what happened in the past. You have to keep being mindful of these past mistakes that we are talking about. So now try to imagine with me. We have a 200,000 years old project, and billions of developers worked on this project. And unlike your previous previous developers, not all of those billions had the best intentions. We had horrible people maintaining that code at some point. Everything in this project is super highly coupled, is super complex to understand, it's horribly documented, and there are no automated tests. There is nothing that will break when you break something, right? That you have zero confidence that what you do can break anything. And obviously this project exists, and it is called humanity, right? And we have all been collectively maintaining this project, this humanity, and we need to keep moving forward, but we need to keep being mindful of what happened in the past. One last thing about the definition of privilege that I would like to mention. It's a tendency in our industry, specifically. We tend to decontextualize stuff. As software engineers, we like to remove the context from things because it makes sense in the code to just think about a unit regardless of where it lives. We always think about things like single responsibility principle. We would like to have this one piece of code that does one thing and one thing only, regardless of whatever is happening around it. We would like to have isolated, decoupled services all over the place. None of them knows about the other. In fact, if I put anything before the word agnostic services, software engineers becomes happy, right? The platform agnostic services, technology agnostic services. Anything that's agnostic of what's surrounding it in the software industry is deemed to be a positive thing. However, it's very important to note for everyone listening to me now is that this does not apply to everything, right? In fact, I have to admit, even in technology, even that we aspire to get to this decontextualizing, it doesn't really work like that in technology. Let's be honest about it. You still have things aware with what's surrounding it. And especially when it comes to social sciences and topics like politics, economics, human sciences in general, context is core. Context is the most necessary thing to understand or analyze what's happening at hand. Right? This is very important to start with. All right. So, as I mentioned in the beginning of this talk, privileged people often use arguments that are quite fallacious to argue against identity politics or political correctness or whatever you want to call the concept that I'm trying to speak about. Also, it's important to note that sometimes it will come out from an underprivileged person. So it's very natural that a woman would say that, or a black person. That doesn't make it right? In fact, I can make a whole other talk based on a lot of research, psychological research and social sciences research about why would an underprivileged person defend oppression or even use these arguments. But that's a topic for later. And I will start with my favorite fallacy. The favorite fallacy is what I call the intention versus the impact. So from my experience, whenever a person of color complains in Europe specifically about racism, the answer they get is, he did not mean it. The person who offended you did not mean to offend you. He just was joking. He was just saying a joke. He did not mean to do whatever. Intention, when you are damaging someone, is an irrelevant factor. Maybe in order to make it clearer, let me tell you this example. When you are in a park and you are throwing frisbee with friends, back then in the times when we used to go to the parks, and if you hit someone with the frisbee in their face and they got concussion, you did not mean it. You were just throwing frisbee, right? But you still got them concussion. You still owe them an apology, and you still need to take them to the hospital in order to fix them. Right? So it's very important to realize that accountability has nothing to do with intention in damaging people. On the other hand, and that's the tricky, interesting part, when you are trying to do something good, intentions and background are really relevant, right? By that here, I mean that, intentions are something that are really good. So by that here, I always use the example of pinkwashing. For those of you who don't know the term, lots of corporates who are known to be super LGBT unfriendly, they oppress their LGBT members. They have a lot of policies that are against LGBT people, However, they would still publish advertisements about how they are supporting gay rights and stuff like that. They do that because they think it's cool, because they think their intentions there is to basically do better PR and not to actually help people. And in these cases, when you are doing things just for PR or for better hiring pipelines rather than for actually helping people, it is very obvious and it has a negative effect. So if you are doing something good, make sure you understand why you are doing it. It's not for PR, it's not for advertisements. You are doing this because there is an actual problem that you are a part of and you are trying to help. Okay, so the first argument that we tried to talk about was the intentions versus impact, right? The second argument we are trying to talk about is the argument that is called the all lives matter. A bit of background here. Back in 2016, if I'm not wrong, specifically as a response to police brutality against the black folks in the US, there was a movement that was born that was called Black Lives Matter. This movement was basically debunked by the right-wing activists, or the right-wing activists all over the world started to respond with a campaign saying not only Black Lives Matter, all lives matter. And they were trying to suggest that Black Lives Matter campaign was about saying that black lives are more important than all other lives. That is not the idea, right? That was not what it was trying to suggest. It was simply trying to point out a statistical fact that black lives, people's lives, are more likely to be ended by the police. This is a statistical fact. This is not an opinion here. They are just trying to point out this inequity so that the country can recognize it and maybe end it, right? We are just saying that black lives matter because it is not now mattering. It seems like it's not mattering for the government. Perhaps the best way to say it is Black Lives Matter too, right? And we are saying is that all lives matter. That's without doubt. All lives totally matter, but it's only one subset that is today in 2020 and back in 2016 and back in 1950, one subset is undervalued. Perhaps this will help you understand it more, so I will let you read this. All right, so why am I saying this, right? Obviously, majority of the attendees are in Zurich, in Europe. This example doesn't really apply. How does that really relate to our software industry? This narrative of all lives matter apply in so many different contexts. In fact, a very common behavior of privileged people is that when you tell them that I am oppressed because this manager is racist against me, is that they will tell you, oh yeah, we are all in the same bucket, I hate this manager. No, you are not. And it's very important to understand that the oppression you are suffering from a person is totally different when you are not from the same privilege level. It's very important to stop trying to put yourself in the same bucket. It's very shameful for me as a man to go to a woman and tell her that toxic masculinity is damaging me as much as her. It is damaging me, but it's not as much as her. And it's kind of trivial that I start to talk about how toxic masculinity damages me in the times that is damaging others with a much bigger, much more severe impact, right? So it's important to stop trying to put yourself into this bucket with other people. The third argument is microaggressions and that people are being oversensitive to microaggressions. And I thought a lot about how can I explain my point there, and I didn't find anything better than this video that I will leave you with for a second.
For people who still don't think that microaggressions are a problem.
Oh, you're so well spoken.
Oh, just imagine, instead of being a stupid comment, a microaggression is a mosquito bite.
Ugh, it's a compliment.
Mosquito bites and their itch are one of nature's most annoying features. But if you're only bitten every once in a while...
No, where are you really from?
Cleveland?
Sure, it's annoying, but it's not that big a deal. The problem is that some people get bitten by mosquitoes a lot more than other people. I mean, a lot more. Whether it's on a date...
Oh, your English is so good.
Excuse me?
Going grocery shopping.
You know, everything happens for a reason.
I'm just buying apples.
Commuting to work.
So when are you gonna have a baby?
Watching TV.
We have to keep the Redskins
name. It's part of our culture and history.
Or just walking down the street with your partner.
I couldn't even tell you were gay.
Mosquitoes seem to pop up everywhere.
Do you know John? Give me shopping advice. I love Cher too.
And getting bit by mosquitoes every goddamn day,
Can I touch your hair?
multiple times a day,
So pretty.
Can I touch it, please?
Can I please?
is fucking annoying. And makes you want to go ballistic on those mosquitoes, which seems like a huge overreaction to people who only get bit every once in a while.
It's just a mosquito bite. Who cares?
Just another angry black woman.
Of course, beyond just being annoying, some mosquitoes carry truly threatening diseases that can mess up your life for years.
Astrophysics? Maybe you should try less challenging, Major.
Ow, my dreams.
And other mosquitoes carry strains that can even kill you.
He looked like he was up to trouble, okay? I felt threatened.
So next time you think someone's overreacting, just remember, some people experience mosquito bites all the time.
You're all so exotic. Wow.
Just remember that some people experience mosquito bites all the time. It's not an overreaction when it happens so continuously that you just can't handle it and you start to be annoyed by these micro small comments. Okay, one next fallacy, which I find it the mother of all these fallacies. It is really the most common one of them all. Is the fallacy of the reverse oppression, reverse sexism, reverse racism, and all sorts of this stuff. I will start by this example here. This person here on Twitter says that being a straight heterosexual male on Twitter in 2018 is harder than it was being openly homosexual in America in the 1960s. Well, this is a very good example of people removing context and not realizing their own privilege in an argument, right? Because as a matter of fact, I have never heard in my whole life of a person being murdered or arrested for being a straight cisgender male on Twitter. What this person is suffering from at the moment is that he cannot make enough jokes about other people. Those same other people who are being murdered, who are being arrested, who are being beaten everywhere around the world today, this person thinks that he is more oppressed than them because he cannot joke about them, because he cannot make fun of them. That's the level of stuff we are talking about. For me, it always reminds me of this joke, right? That a baby went crying to his father, a British baby went crying to his father saying, "Father, I don't understand, this is unfair that the whole world has an Independence Day and we don't." Well, there is a reason for that. So it's important to note, it is not sexism, it's not racism, it's not any sort of oppression unless it has an attached historical baggage to it, something that happened in the past that deepened this. And if you go backwards in time to this moment, that person was suffering, and in fact it's still going until today. It cannot be considered oppression unless there is a privileges imbalance there. Because if it's two people who are on the same equal level, you never heard about a people saying that, I don't know, right-handed people are oppressing left-handed people or vice versa, because they almost have the same privileges worldwide, right? So it's not just about being different, it's about being one side is more powerful than the other side. That is the core of it. And speaking of this, for example, we cannot say that a Jewish person talking badly of a Nazi German in 1932 considered an anti-Semitism. That just doesn't work like this, right? It is anti-Semitism because there was a higher privileged group that was oppressing a lower privileged group. And that was it. To sum it up, we are not trying to seek equality. That is not really what we are trying to seek. We are trying to seek what we call equity and liberation. If you look at those three people here, they don't start from the same base, and I am trying to give people who are less fortunate more opportunities so that we get to the same equal opportunity at the end, right? And eventually, and that's my hope, we will reach liberation where the three of us together can push this wall and watch the game without a barrier. But we are not there yet. There are other fallacies that I would like to mention, but not so deeply. The fallacy of whataboutism or whataboutery. Very funny situation, but I have seen it a lot, and it's quite common, especially in the post-Soviet Union countries. Basically, this concept is about when you tell someone, okay, there is racism in the world, and then they start to tell you, but what about the cancer patients? I don't know, what about them? This is a fallacy, right? Like, focus on the argument we are talking about. I have full sympathy with cancer patients. My father himself is a cancer patient, but that has nothing to do with me having to prioritize. And what is it trying to do with whataboutism usually is that they try to put the oppressed groups in opposition to each other rather than the oppressor, right? So instead of both of us talking about, okay, why is that person making that thing to us? No, we are just trying to choose which one of them has the higher priority, and that shouldn't be the case at all. The fallacy that's very important is my black friend said, or I have one black friend and he said this, or my woman friend said that. As I previously mentioned, people who are underprivileged can say things that are not supportive of political correctness sometimes. They don't represent the whole race, and this is very important to mention. I also don't represent the whole race for that sake, but also there is a lot of signs that I can assure you that this black friend of yours who tells you that is telling you that most of the times just to protect themselves because they don't trust you. And when I talk to the same person, they will come and tell me I was just being not honest with that person. This situation happens so much in our workplaces, you have no idea. One last thing is this, your word against his word. It's very common usually in sexual harassment cases, or I don't know, it's the same also when you try to report racism cases. What this is doing here is that it's trying to treat systematic oppression, a society problem, as if it's a normal crime problem. Think about it with a very clear example. If a Jewish person comes to you and tells you I was tortured in Nazi Germany, you will not tell him, oh no, it's your word against the word of the officers of Nazi Germany. It is obvious, if you were a Jewish person back then, you were most likely to be tortured. It's the same, if you are a black person today, you are most likely to be get racist comments, or if you are a woman today, there is a high likeliness that you get sexually harassed. So it is not your word against his word. In fact, we are not even in a criminal court here. We are really pointing out a clear societal issue and a systematic issue. So it's important to steer away from this narrative and try to realize the systematic oppression that is there. Okay, that's it with the ethical part. The question is it only a question of ethics, right? Is it only something about politics and ethical stuff? No, it's not. It also has impact into our products, into our projects that we work on. And I will try in the next phase to give you some examples of impacts that happens from these things into our projects. The first example is what I like to call the famous last name issue, which in my opinion is so not famous. So I work with web development, and most of the times when we model users, when we have a database table of users, we would often have the usual fields like first name, last name, email address, password, and so on and so forth. This is like a very basic thing, right? Like this is probably a common line in most tutorials of web frameworks around the world. And there is an implicit assumption there that each person that will use your application, every user you will have a first and the last name, right? And this assumption is a very good example of what's called the false consensus effect. For those of you who don't know false consensus effect, it's a cognitive bias where we as people, including myself, tend to believe that those other people have the same habits, the same thoughts, the same beliefs, the same opinions that I do or we do. And that's so far from the truth, right? We are different people. And in this case, let me surprise you. I personally don't have a last name. In fact, as a matter of fact, like around 100 million Egyptians don't have last names because we follow a totally different naming convention. And I'm pretty sure this is not just Egypt. There are plenty of countries around the world that don't have last names or have last names into different formats. And as this issue might seem trivial for you, right? However, this issue caused me personally loads of issues in the past, and every single time I mention this issue to someone who is probably not North American or European, they give me loads of examples of issues they have because of the systems built to not accept their names properly. One of the most common examples is, of course, the ASCII code in names, for example, when someone has an apostrophe or has like an umlaut in their names. In the US elections last year, they did not accept, in the US elections in 2015 or 16, I forgot the time, there were places that you couldn't vote when your name had an umlaut in them, right? That is a product that is not functioning, is not a sound, complete project anymore. And all of that because you did not think about including people who are not like yourself, because your name doesn't have umlauts, your name has first name and last name. There is this awesome GitHub repo called the Awesome Falsehood. It tries to collect a list of these falsehoods that we as programmers believe in. And for example, there is the human identity section. It has like 10 articles about things that we all do about names that are wrong, or things about gender that we all do that are wrong. All do, even including myself. It's very important to say that these are just so common that even me myself would fall for them, or plenty of other people who are underprivileged would fall for them. The second example that I like to call, between quotes, the racist camera phenomenon. So the internet is full. Like, you can, after this talk, go and check YouTube for issues between cameras and races. A good example is this. Nikon had this AI that was saying someone is blinking whenever someone Asian appears in this camera screen. Or this video. Let's take a look.
Oh, Desi. This is using the video tracking software.
All right.
Explain.
My coworker Wanda and I are sitting in front of an HP Media Smart computer. State-of-the-art computer, wouldn't you say?
I'd say.
We're using the face tracking software, so it's supposed to follow me as I move. I'm black. I think my blackness is interfering with the computer's ability to follow me. As you can see, I do this, no following. Not really following me. I back up. I get really close to try to let the camera recognize me. Not happening. Now, my white coworker Wanda is about to slide into frame. You will immediately see what I'm talking about. Wanda, if you would, please.
Sure.
Now, as you can see, the camera is panning to show Wanda's face. It's following her around. But as soon as my blackness enters the frame, which I will sneak into the frame. I'm sneaking in. I'm in there.
That's it. It's
and
over.
There we go. It stopped. My hands are here. Wanda, please get back in the frame. Get back in. As soon as white Wanda appears, the camera moves. Black.
So, I mean, how does this happen, really? I mean, do you really believe that technology is racist? Obviously not. Technology is technology, it's a machine. But this specific story with cameras especially has a very long history. Shirley cards. If any one of you knows this fine lady in this photo, her name is Shirley. She used to be the model for Kodak color reference cards back in the 60s and 50s. These colors were the standard color reference cards for the industry of photography. They were using the film chemistry, was using these colors to produce the the film camera industry was the camera film industry, sorry, was using the standard color reference cards to make the chemistry of their films. And it was designed with intentional bias towards light skin. Intentional here is very key, because back in the 60s and 50s, there are lots of meetings where people were saying, okay, you know, we are ignoring black people and people of color out of this thing. And the answer that they were always getting were things like, yeah, black people can't afford to buy a camera anyways, so why bother and why make the film more expensive by covering these colors? However, we moved to the modern days of digital cameras, but somehow these implications still moved on with us for some reason. Of course, there are, especially in the past 15 to 20 years, there are lots of improvements. However, this still has its implications in the modern days of digital cameras, right? So just because back in the 60s someone decided intentionally to exclude someone, it still has implications today. The last example I would like to point out is the mysterious case of sexist airbags. So a piece of information for you is that when airbags were first released, women and children were less safe using airbags in comparison to men. True story. That happened again because of false consensus bias, because it was all male engineer teams that thought that the average height and weight is their average height and weight, which is not true. And they made the test dummies based on their own average height and weights, which is for males, obviously. So it's important here to note that inclusive design, thinking about inclusion of other people, needs to happen at each and every stage of the product development. Starting from hiring your team, you need to hire people who are diverse enough, otherwise false consensus will kick in. And then you need to think about it when you are collecting requirements, when you are designing the product, when you are implementing the project, when you are testing the project. At every stage of the product development, you need to have inclusion as a key aspect of it. Otherwise, you are not building a sound, complete product. You are building a product that is only working for you and people that are similar to you. Nothing else. So, what to do now? I mean, I buy what you're saying. I just don't know what should I do. As an employee, as a software engineer in our industry, basically, you need to recognize one interesting fact. All of us in this room, people who are software engineers, are privileged by default, because we need to recognize these privileges, as we are in a very candidate-driven market compared to the majority of the markets of the world, right? Most of us, when we want to look for jobs, it's companies hunting after us, companies trying to hire us rather than the opposite, right? It's us who are selecting between jobs, not the opposite. We need to understand that this is a privilege that not everyone in the world has. People suffer to find jobs, especially in the current situation of Corona, for example. So we need to recognize this privilege and act upon it. Acting upon it includes things like being humble. It's very important to realize that you are not that smart or whatever. No, be humble and try to listen when people talk about things, because oftentimes people, when they are privileges, they tend to dismiss any input into these topics because they are just so arrogant to listen even to others. So I remind myself, we are not as smart as we think we are. So even when you think that you cracked the code and you understand this whole thing and you just have this very unique opinion, which is so not unique about reverse sexism, it's not unique. You are not as smart as you think. And there are hundreds of years of research that suggest that you are wrong. So no, stop trying to act like this smart person. And do your homework. Go and read this research. Go and study on the internet before you start repeating fallacies without even understanding them. Most importantly is that you need to speak up when you see something wrong. By that I'm saying, for example, if people in the warehouse of your company are struggling, speak up for them, because you have the privilege to do that, because your company would most probably be afraid to fire you instead of firing them. Speak up for your people of color colleague, for your LGBT colleague, because you are the person of privilege. If you own a company, or if you're a CEO, or if you're at an executive level in a company, you also need to recognize that this issue is important. It's important, by the way, for the return of investment. If you want to speak in very pragmatic terms, lots of companies can prove to you that focusing on these issues made them make more money. That's one side. But recognize the issue for the sake of your employees as well. Hire diversity professionals. Those people exist. There are people in the market that are diversity professionals that can train your employees, audit your processes, can help you do better job at this. Hire them. As I mentioned, stop this pinkwashing attitude. Stop hiring people and say that you care about diversity when you don't. Just unless you understand what diversity is about, unless you understand what inclusion is about, don't claim you are, because this attitude is damaging us. We are not tokens, right? I hate being hired as a token. I'm not a token for you to put me in the cover of your university company website. So understand, why are you hiring people with diversity quotas if you are doing that? When you have an underprivileged employee that complains about something, make sure to listen, and listen carefully. Make sure that your company has an open and a transparent communication framework for such issues. whether anonymous, non-anonymous, every company needs to have a clear code of conduct, a person that I can report to, anonymously or not. I should feel safe to go and speak that my colleague was racist against me. I should feel safe about this. And the mother of all these problems in companies, especially in tech companies, is that people tend to shut down the conversation because it's hard. This conversation is hard, yes, for you, but it's way harder for the oppressed people. So stop shutting it down. Stop dismissing this conversation when it pops up. This conversation is important. You need to have it in your company. As a tech community member, when you are a member of any of the tech communities, make sure to look for diversity-related initiatives, initiatives that try to solve the diversity imbalance between women and men, like, for example, Women Who Codes, Rails Girls, Django Girls, Code Curious, Hispanic coding, refugees. There are almost an organization that supports each and every underprivileged minority somewhere in the world. Make sure to try to go and volunteer some of your time, some of your money, some of your knowledge to support these groups, right? But again, as I mentioned earlier, make sure you understand why are you doing this. You're not supporting these things because you are a nice person. That's not the idea. It's not about feeling good about yourself. That's not the idea, because it's not about you at all. It's just because you are there to solve a problem that your sole existence, is part of causing this problem in the beginning. Right? It's very important to know that your privileges, your own identity, is part of making this system problematic, and you need to do an extra effort to get over this debt that you owe from the past. Once you understand enough, try to write blog posts about your experiences, explain to people. Go to conferences and meetups and speak there like I'm doing now, and try to speak to people about this concept and enable people to see these other contexts. Most importantly, if you are not an underprivileged person, understand the difference between allyship and being in the same bucket of the oppressed person. And there are lots of books, lots of researches about the concept of allyship. Try to learn further about that. Try to learn how to be a good ally and stop putting yourself in the same bucket of the oppressed minority. Okay. So many people would end up saying things, but why don't we just all be nice to each other and just move on from this topic and forget about the past? I hope that you understand that your ability to be sick of politics is on its own a privilege in action. You are sick of politics because it's your privileges that allows you to live this politics-free life. Because you are less likely to be a target of bigotry. You are less likely to be deported, physically attacked in the street. It can happen, but you are less likely, statistically speaking. And you are tired of this hustle because your safety is not at stake, but our safety is at stake. Also, and this is a very common narrative, that you think that people are playing the victim cards or looking for some attention. They are attention whatever by calling out on these topics. I just want to point it out that it's really hard and really exhausting for any of underprivileged groups to bring up these topics of oppression. It's super hard, way harder than you imagine. And we know that for you this fight is tiring and annoying and it's a lot of hustle, but trust me, for us it's much higher. And it's much harder because for us we are fighting for life and safety, not just for being able to say a joke. And if you don't really see how are we fighting for our lives by this, that simply is because of your privilege. And that's it. Thank you so much, and hopefully I can get questions from you.